It's good to be back with all of you again, and it certainly has been another eventful week in politics. We are now at the end of the Republican nominating convention. So we've had in the last 2 weeks the Democrats and the Republicans, and I'm going to focus on the state of the campaign and the political argument between the Democrats and the Republicans today. I will concentrate more on the Republicans because they just concluded their nominating convention, and I had focused last week on the Democrats. So give me just a moment to get the screen share going and show you a little bit of information about what's been happening in the country, the state of the race, and the Republican convention in particular. All right, that's the end. Let's go up to the beginning. All right. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, and there have been some developments that affect the state of the race over the last week since we spoke. And as you can see, if you remember from last week, this was, I believe, 73 to 27 in favor of Biden. And so Trump's position has improved slightly in the last week. I'll speak with you a little bit about why that is, and point out to you, as I did last week, and I'll refresh your memory just briefly, this is not merely polling. This is a model. And so this is a model that attempts to overcome some of the limitations of polling. Polling says, this is what people say right now, who they're going to vote for. And as I'll show you in a moment, Trump's polling has not improved. Biden's polling has really not declined. If you look at it, taking not a look at this or that poll, because polls always have defects, but if you look at an average of polls, Biden's lead is pretty steady at this point. We'll see if Trump gets a bump from the convention or not. But right now, not a lot of good high quality polls being conducted, but those that are show Biden's lead steady. But what has changed in ways I'll talk about a little later in the lecture is that there's been some improvement in terms of the country's handling of the coronavirus. The number of deaths, the number of new cases are going down. And there's some signs that the economy is doing a little bit better. Now, in both of those regards, I will point out to you, and this is important to recognize, that the data that we have available to us now reflect how things looked 2 or 3 weeks ago, not how they look right now. And things are going to change rapidly. We are now about, I believe, 70 days from the election, just under 2 months away. It seems a little hard to believe that we're this close to a national election, but we're about to start September. And so we're really ticking down to the most heated period in the election cycle. And I expect that there's going to be even more volatility in this election cycle than we've seen in the past. And that is because, of course, we are in the grips of several simultaneous crises. There's the pandemic, which most experts expect will get worse as we enter the winter, as we enter the flu season. And I certainly hope that everyone there has had their flu shots and their pneumonia shots. I'm not a doctor, but my understanding is that those are the things that are most important to be able to keep yourself healthy until there is a coronavirus vaccine. Having said that, people do expect what some people are calling a twindemic, that is to say the flu and the coronavirus overlapping, and that things may begin getting worse in October. And so that may impact the campaign. Obviously, the economy is severely affected. And I will speak more about this soon by what's happening with the coronavirus. And because we don't know what's going to happen with the coronavirus in September, October, November, we also don't know what will happen with the economy. And I'll speak with you more about this, but there's some talk of a W recession. So if you remember, I spoke with you a while ago about this, that the idea of a V recession or an L recession. A V recession goes down sharply and comes back up sharply, right? And so that's the V. An L goes down sharply and comes up very slowly. And the current thinking is that we may experience neither of those scenarios, that we started something of a V recession, and tremendous government spending was responsible for the fact that although we went down sharply, we started to come up pretty sharply as well, having a recovery beginning in June and continuing through July, but that it may be that we're going to go back down again. And so that's the W. We go down, we go up, we go down, we go up, right? And so all of that to say, we will have to see what happens in the economy. This model is built on what's happening with the virus and the economy and the polls and the news cycle, right? And so there are a lot of factors built into it. Based on those factors, it appears that Trump is improving in his prospects to gain a second term. But having said that, and this I think is extremely important, ultimately what determines the outcome of this election is the states, right? We have an electoral college, and as we well know, you could win the popular vote and lose the electoral college vote, and nothing has changed at the state level, which is to say, this is identical to the diagram that I showed you a week ago, because all the state level polling, and there's not a lot right now, seems to show that Joe Biden has maintained his lead in these crucial states: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Florida, and Arizona. Now, as I say, this has tightened. Last week, there was a larger margin or a larger chance of winning for Biden. This week, it's shrunk by about a little bit less than 10%. But that is not because of the polls. And if you look, the polls are actually a little bit better for Biden than they were a week ago. So he's got basically a 9% lead nationally over Trump. And that's a quite robust lead. I would point out to you that no incumbent has ever trailed by this much in national polls in the modern polling era, going back to the early 1960s. And so by these standards, Trump is not doing well. And again, the fact that a challenger has on this model still something like a 2/3 chance of winning the presidency does indicate that Donald Trump is not doing well overall. So that's the background in terms of the vote. Let's get into the Republican National Convention. I don't know how many of you watched all of it. I will show you some information on it. But before I do that, I want to kind of try to synthesize it for you by pointing out what I think are the 4 main themes of this convention, and then from there transitioning into a little bit of analysis. So the first big theme, this fits into an overarching all message. And I do think there is an underlying unity to Trump's messaging from 2016 and 2020, and that is that the country is headed in a terrible direction, and that mainstream politics is responsible for that, and that we need an outsider populist leader like Donald Trump to fix it. And that in particular, Donald Trump represents a tradition that is under siege. That's the tradition of white suburban power in the United States, and that he will not play nice. He will not be politically correct. He will restore that order, and only he has the level of aggression, the outsider status, the capacity to do this. So that message was, I think, very potent and plausible in 2016. He had never been an elected official. He came from the world of business and entertainment television, and he was saying this system is broken and you need somebody from the outside to fix it. In 2020, you will have noted that the Republicans actually just reproduced their platform from 2016, right? They did not produce a new platform. That might seem a little strange, right? And a number of people have poked fun at the fact that they seem to be blaming the current occupant of the White House for things that are wrong. And of course, the current occupant of the White House is Donald Trump. That's what happens when you reproduce your platform. Things change, but the platform doesn't. That points out the difficulty of rerunning the 2016 campaign. It's hard to portray Donald Trump as an outsider anymore, but, and here I think it's critical, that Trump is trying to turn the conversation in a way that suggests that most of what is wrong in America is not his fault, and that it will take another 4 years for him to fix it. And so who is to blame? And let me suggest, I really should have listed 3 items on the "this is not Trump's fault" theme of the convention. And I think this was perhaps the single most important theme. And if it succeeds, it will give Donald Trump a fighting chance to win this election. If it doesn't succeed, if people blame Donald Trump for the coronavirus, for the economic damage that it has caused, for the state of unrest in our country right now, then I don't think Donald Trump has a viable path to victory in November. So for this messaging to succeed, it has to be the case that there are viable alternative explanations for what's troubling the country. And one of the things that Trump has been masterful in doing is playing the politics of us versus them, the politics that says we, the true citizens of this country, are blameless, and they, whether they are foreigners or they are Americans, but of a suspect category, people who are not like the true citizens of the country, are to blame for all that ails America. So who is to blame for the coronavirus pandemic? That would be China, right? And Donald Trump has referred to this as Kung Flu, as the China virus. He's trying to rename it, rebrand it in a way. And this is one of the things that Trump does wonderfully: Slow Joe, Sleepy Joe, etc., right? Taking his opponents or another threat and labeling it in a way that evaluates it to begin with. So the coronavirus is the China virus, right? It came from outside this country. It is a foreign invasion of this country. It's not the fault of the United States government or of Donald Trump that we have been attacked by this virus. And in fact, given that it's a foreign invasion, he has done a great job defending us from it, right? That's the first effort here. And again, the data I've shown you over the last few weeks, particularly the data that shows that the United States is unique among developed countries in the world in the extent of fatalities and the amount of time that it's taken us to manage it, does tend to undercut this messaging, right? We have roughly 5% of the world's population, but 20% of the cases. And so something is askew in our management of the virus. But if it is possible to claim this is exclusively the fault of another country, then perhaps Donald Trump can succeed in persuading the voters he needs to reach that he should not be held to account for these problems. The other big effort to assign blame elsewhere is to point at the Democrats and the deep state, right? And so if the CDC won't approve, or the National Institutes of Health won't approve blood plasma treatment for the coronavirus, that's because the deep state is still trying to get the president, right? And it's using medicine to interfere in the election, refusing to treat the coronavirus adequately. And here you see the intersection of domestic politics and public health politics, right? And the claim is that the CDC and the NIH are not responding to science and medicine. They are playing politics with American health. And so Trump ultimately prevailed. He did get the plasma treatment approved on an expedited emergency basis. And if you watch the coverage on Fox News, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, this is a major victory for the people of the United States and their battle against coronavirus. Donald Trump is fast-tracking the vaccine, creating a Manhattan Project or a Marshall Plan for the United States in order to help us cope with this. And if it's not succeeding, that's because the deep state is still fighting him, and he needs another 4 years to overcome the bureaucratic inertia or the hostility of the deep state. One other aspect of this is to say that America is on the brink, and we'll talk more about this on the next point, of anarchy, chaos, lawlessness, and that this is exclusively the fault of Democrats, and in particular, Democratic governors and mayors in places like Portland and Kenosha, Wisconsin, Chicago, etc., that we are coming unglued as a society, and that the reason that we are coming unglued is because the Democrats refuse to impose law and order. And not only that, they are in fact stoking the very forces that are forces of lawlessness in this country. If you listen to Fox News again, you know, I know many of you probably don't tend to agree with the editorial slant of Fox News, but I would encourage you to watch it because it's very important to understand what the largest segment of the news watching public in the United States watches. If you watch that station, Black Lives Matter is a Marxist anarchist organization that is bent on overthrowing law and order in the United States. And to the extent that Democrats have sympathy with Black Lives Matter, then they are part of the problem. All right, so that's theme number one. Yeah, I'll hold off. Let me turn to theme number two. We are at the brink of anarchy. And so the coronavirus, the economic damage that it's done, the protests in our streets, increase in crime, all of this indicates that the United States is coming apart. The center no longer holds. We are dealing with a period in which, if there is not a strong governmental response using police and military if necessary, the suburbs in particular are going to be overwhelmed with violence. Now, I would point out to you, if we look at this objectively, there has been an uptick in crime. There's been an uptick in violent crime over the last 6 months. And this is unsurprising, given the number of people who have lost their jobs, given the fact that we have major protests going on in many cities intermittently, that there would be some looting, that there would be some rioting, that there would be some increase in violent crime is unsurprising. But I'm going to give you a whole lecture on this later. If you were to look at the rates of violence in the United States, say over a 25-year period, they are much lower today. They've declined by over 50% in most areas in the United States over the last quarter century. And that is an objective fact. And this uptick that we're seeing now does not mitigate that, right? It's a slight increase from a very low level based on historical data. But if you do polls and you ask people, is the United States less violent today than it was 25 years ago? Is there less crime today than there was 25 years ago? If you ask people, how likely are you to be a victim of crime? People's subjective impressions are not at all accurate. It's an interesting phenomenon. And so if you look in particular at that third category, how likely are you to be a victim of crime? Most people overestimate the likelihood that they will be a victim of crime by 10 to 14 times the amount, right? There's about a 1% chance that you would be a victim of crime in any given year. Most people think there's about a 10 to 14% chance. And so they grossly overestimate. And it's interesting to try to figure out why, but it does appear that one major factor is that even when crime rates go down, the amount of attention paid to crime on the news remains constant. And that particularly if you're watching the local news, there's a very strong focus on violent crime, especially at the beginning of the news, which is the part that most people watch. You're familiar with the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. This is in fact true based on objective analysis of what's on the news. And it does appear to be distorting our perception of how dangerous or disorderly the country is right now. And again, I would point out to you, if you look at Fox News in particular, or if you look at local news as opposed to national news stations like CNN or ABC, CBS, MSNBC, PBS, you see much higher rates of coverage of violent crime. And so again, I think objectively, it's not the case that we're on the brink of anarchy. I want to be very clear about this. This is a message. This is a ploy. This is an attempt to stoke fear because, again, this is the best strategy that the president has to win re-election. It is not accurate. And so whether this will succeed in persuading people would be the big question coming out of the Republican National Convention. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Trump will fix this, right? That's the third big message. And I think this is important and subtle and in fact, quite well done. The claim is, if we look at the economy for a minute, which I do want to spend a little bit more time focusing on, that Trump built the best economy in post-war American history. That the virus, which attacked us from China, and the lack of cooperation from the Democrats and the deep state allowed the virus to do tremendous economic damage. But given the past success that Trump has had in creating conditions for economic growth, he is the one who will best repair the damage to the economy, right? So I hope that is clear. The damage to the economy is not Trump's fault. The strength in the economy prior to the virus, Trump gets credit for, and therefore he's the right person to repair the economy. It's again, I think you've got to accept each element in that argument, and I suspect many of us don't, but it's as good a case for Trump as I think you can make in these circumstances. And so this was the third big prong in the overall messaging of the convention. The fourth big prong is that Joe Biden is not the right person to address the troubles of the country right now, that he lacks energy, that he lacks the capacity to control his own agenda, that therefore he has been captured by the radical left of the Democratic Party, that Kamala Harris represents the fact that he's been captured by the radical left, and that as a result, he will be a Black Lives Matter president, that he will be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's puppet in the White House, and so that he will do things that are bad for the economy, bad for the suburbs, bad for law and order, that if we don't like where the country is right now, don't blame Donald Trump. Think about how much worse it would be if Joe Biden is president, right? And again, there's some subtle or not so subtle but difficult messaging going on here, but obviously a frontal assault on Joe Biden, including by the president himself last night. And again, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that Joe Biden didn't mention Donald Trump by name in his speech. Donald Trump went directly after Joe Biden in his speech. Now, the fifth point, there was not much effort at overall coherence in this convention. I'll take a single example. As many of you saw on Tuesday night, they actually broadcast a naturalization ceremony where a group of diverse people gained citizenship in the United States, with Donald Trump presiding over that ceremony and speaking about each individual in a quite gracious way. Now, one of the questions will be that presents a nice face on Donald Trump with regards to immigration. Clearly, part of what he's responding to in showing that on TV is the fact that his polling shows that white suburban women no longer support him or have serious doubts about him, in part because he separated immigrant children from their parents, locked them in cages on the border, put them in situations where they got sick, died. Some of them have been permanently orphaned, right? Does the presentation of a naturalization ceremony on national TV during a convention soften Donald Trump's image on this somewhat? How does that play with the crime and law and order themes that we're on the brink of anarchy, and that Trump has the toughness and the aggression, the commitment to law enforcement to address this? How does that cohere with, oh yeah, and he's going to be nicer on immigration, at least for the right kinds of immigrants, right? And what I think is clear, and I'll just give you my analysis here for a moment. The Democrats worked very hard to present a coherent image of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, that there's a coalescing of Democrats around Joe Biden, that the primary reason they're supporting him is because of the threat that Donald Trump represents to democracy, the climate, the country, the health of the nation, but also that Joe Biden has the integrity, the passion, the compassion to be an effective transitional leader. The Republicans did not attempt, I think, to present that kind of coherent message. Night by night, things shifted. There was the Tuesday night effort to reach out to women, with the majority of speakers being women, highlighted or capped by Melania Trump's address, Nikki Haley speaking as well, whereas Wednesday and Thursday were very male, very testosterone heavy, right? Very much focused on the law and order theming. Those things don't go particularly well together. I think the hope is that different people will respond to different evenings, and that coherence may not matter as much in 2020 as apparently the Democrats, hope or think that it will. So just to engage in a little bit of analysis here, what the convention reveals about the Republican Party right now. And the first thing is that it is Trump's party. There was no dissidence. There was no room for anybody who was not a Trump Republican. It was very unusual. You'll note that Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, and Jimmy Carter all spoke during the Democrats' national convention. Not a single past Republican president, nor any representative of a past Republican candidate spoke in this convention. It was exclusively the people who Trump has brought into or who have become Trump-backing Republicans who spoke. And so this was very much a narrowly consolidated leadership convention. The second idea here is that coherence was not the aim, that they really did not care to present a unified image, and that there was obvious dissonance between the nights, tension as different themes were trotted out. The third big theme, and I want to focus on this for a couple of minutes, is that this was what I would call a full embrace of post-truth politics. And I spoke about this with various themes, the idea that this is not Trump's fault, the idea that Trump will fix this, the idea that the Democrats are disqualified given who their leadership is. And I would suggest to you that much of this goes against what I think any impartial, objective analysis would say is the fact of the matter, right? And so I don't want to claim, I want to be clear about this, that all of politics can be understood from a single impartial objective point of view. All controversy reflects confusion or dissimilitude. But having said that, there are some things that clearly are not true, right? And so the idea that it's the deep state's fault and the Democrats' fault that the coronavirus has spread and done so much damage, there may be blame enough to go around, but at least some of that blame does fall at Donald Trump's feet, right? And the fact that we have not had a coherent national policy, that we have not produced enough protective equipment, enough testing capacity, enough tracking capacity, that we have not encouraged the adherence to norms that have been proven to combat the transmission of the virus while we don't have good therapeutic treatments for it. All of that is important to the explanation of why the United States is doing so much worse than the rest of the world. And a lot of that does have to do with Donald Trump as president, his management of the virus, right? And so I'll give you a little bit of information here for a moment. Did I go past it? Yes, I did. That I wanted to come to in a minute, but I think it's relevant right now. This is about the distribution of attention on media. And I want you to look at this for a minute, and I'll unpack it for you. I know it doesn't make a great deal of sense on its own, but this is the left wing of the media sphere, and this is the right wing of the media sphere, and this is the center of the media sphere. And in general, one expects that the diagram would look something like this, right? On the far left, not a lot of attention. The closer you get to the center left, more attention, right? And then going back down again, right? So that's a relatively smooth curve, and you would expect this to look something like an M, right? With the right mirroring the structure of attention on the left. This means that mainstream, middle of the road, left media, CNN, if you will, gets the most attention. But if you look on the right, in fact, the places that are kind of middle right, the Wall Street Journal would be a good example of this, are not getting a lot of attention. And the places that are far right, Breitbart and Fox News, are getting the most attention, right? And the reason I bring this in right now is because, again, if you watch Fox News, there's direct reinforcement of what the president is saying at his convention. And so one of the things to note is that the way in which we make up our minds about politics depends on the information that we're getting. So very few of us go out and get firsthand information. Very few of us, frankly, have more than one or two, maybe at most three media sources for our information. We have other things to do with our time, with our energy, with our attention. We may not find it very rewarding. And so we rely on authority, on leaders, on media outlets to help us to process the complex and varied information coming at us each week. And that is, I think, the nature of the world, the nature of human cognition, if you will. And I'm going to speak with you more in a subsequent lecture about QAnon, right? QAnon is an online conspiracy theory that suggests that there is a deep state, a cabal running the United States government, and that Donald Trump is the main person battling against the deep state, that the deep state is not just usual bureaucratic inertia, it's a deep, corrupt conspiracy that includes Democrats engaging in things like child trafficking with Jeff Epstein and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton complicit in importing and using and selling children for sexual slavery. I'm not making this up. This is the actual nature of what circulates with people who pay attention to QAnon and various social media platforms. And what is striking is that it appears that tens of millions of Americans buy into this conspiracy theory. And so what I'm suggesting to you is, and again, I will speak with you more about this in the future, but that we live in a moment where access to information is fractured. And what is seen on one side of the media ecosystem and what is seen on another side of the media ecosystem have absolutely no resemblance to each other. There are at least two worlds, and I don't want to suggest that they are equal and that there's a relative this perspective here where either you're on the left or you're on the right. If you're on the left, you get one kind of news. If you're on the right, you get another. I definitely believe, and I believe there's a lot of objective ways of demonstrating that the mainstream middle left media does a much better job at fact checking, at validating and correcting information than does the right. And so in a sense, what happened at the convention this year is a full embrace of post-truth politics, that things can be made up. Coherence doesn't matter. Verifiability doesn't matter, because if we say it, and if the portion of the media ecosystem that our supporters listen to repeat it loudly enough and often enough, it will become the effective political reality for our side. The fourth thing, analytically, that I find very interesting is that there was actually very little mention of the pain that the coronavirus has caused. In fact, rather little mention of the coronavirus as such. When it was mentioned, it was talked about exclusively in terms of a foreign threat. Melania Trump really is the only person who mentioned the number of people who have succumbed to this disease and the pain that it has caused, and expressed her condolences or sympathy for those people. That was almost entirely absent from this convention otherwise. And I guess it does speak to Donald Trump's style of leadership. He is not the politician who is going to console us. He's not the kind of politician who feels our pain and who we look to for, if you will, emotional leadership. Or his emotional range is primarily anger and fear, not sympathy, empathy, helping us to cope with painful events. Final thing to note is that there were major things happening in the rest of the country as this convention unfolded. There were huge, ongoing, incredibly destructive forest fires and wildfires in Northern California that are affecting the air quality all the way to Nebraska, right? And so the state of California is mainly under lockdown. Tens of thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed. And this is the largest wildfire complex on record. Almost not mentioned at all. Hurricane Laura was bearing down on the Gulf Coast on the day of Trump's address. There was very little mention of it either. And obviously the fires and the hurricane lead into the theme of global climate change. We are in a period of severe weather. There was not a lot of attention paid to it. And Kenosha, Wisconsin has been gripped by, as you're well aware, violence, protest, mainly peaceful protests, but there were shootings 2 nights ago. I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a minute. But there was another incidence of police violence, a white police officer against an African-American man. African-American man was shot multiple times in a situation where it appeared he posed little threat to the police and was, in fact, driving his children in his car. He has survived, but his condition is still unclear. And so there have been protests in Wisconsin. And this was mentioned exclusively under the law and order rubric, not at all under the police violence or civil rights rubrics. And so again, an interesting effort to cherry pick what was happening in the country for the sake of discussing only those themes that made sense. Last thing I want to talk with you about is who spoke at the convention and how the time was distributed. I showed you this last week with the Democrats as a way of thinking about which themes and which kinds of persons were highlighted. You can see that there were 5 people who got to speak for more than 10 minutes. Donald Trump spoke for 70 minutes, right? Half again as long as Joe Biden. Mike Pence spoke for half the amount of time that Donald Trump did. Melania Trump, basically a quarter of the time. But here's the other thing I want you to notice, right? Of the people who got to speak for more than 10 minutes, only 2 of them are not members of the Trump family, right? Donald Trump, Melania Trump, Ivanka Trump, and Donald Trump Jr. Took up the majority of the prime time of this broadcast. And then if you look at the people who spoke 5 to 10 minutes, Eric Trump and Laura Trump, we have an awful lot of the Trump family speaking at this convention. So the other thing I think to notice is that there were a lot of women featured at this convention. That's not accidental, right? And in particular, a lot of white women. And that is a major demographic that the Republicans are trying to win. But the final thing to notice is that every one of these speakers is a solid Trump supporter. There's nobody from any other faction in the Republican Party. And I think part of the question here is whether there are in fact other factions in the Republican Party at this moment. All right, so that concludes what I wanted to say about the Republican National Convention. Let me now go ahead and open up for questions. So I am going to unmute everyone, and you can start me out. If there aren't, oh, there's an echo, huh? There, that's better, good. I will move on to talking a little bit more about the economy, but let's give you guys a chance for questions first. Who wants to start us out? Anne, are you?
I am here, and I feel so much more relieved after hearing you talk about this convention, because the little bit that I watched really upset me terribly to think that some people believed all this bullshit. Pardon my expression.
That's a technical political science term. Yes, go ahead.
Feel much better. Thank you for enlightening me and making me feel better. Okay?
Well, let me try to just say I'm certainly glad that it helped to make it intelligible. I'm not sure we should be feeling better about American democracy. It helps us to see what the strategy was that the Republicans are using. But if the strategy is a post-truth strategy, and if democracy requires, sorry for the old-fashioned language, an enlightened public, right? A public that actually understands the issues, because the public ultimately determines who leads them, who makes the most important decisions, right? In a sense, the public gets to make the essential decision, who will be the decision. If the public is confused, if it's befuddled, if it's benighted, then democracy is damaged, right? And I do think that this was, in a sense, a kind of shameless exercise in spinning. And obviously, every party does that. All politicians do that. You know, politicians don't get elected because they are
honest.
Well, completely honest all of the time, right? They're 100% truth tellers.
Yeah.
But they do, in well-functioning democracies, get held to account for obvious falsification. And it's just not clear that that is functioning in one of the two major parties in the United States right now.
Mm. Thank you.
Of course. Anybody else with the question about what they saw, or anything else about the politics of the last week?
David, can you?
I can. Michelle, do you have your hand up?
The name is Rhoda Meisner, yes.
Oh,
I'd like to ask you about the finances of the Trumps that were related in Mary's book, Mary Trump. Can you enlighten us on the finances of the Trumps?
I'm not well prepared to go into the details of that today, but there's an awful lot there, and so some of the with Deutsche Bank, right? And one of the things you'll note is that the financial records of Donald Trump and the Trump Corporation have been subpoenaed from Deutsche Bank, which has been really the only bank that's been willing to do business with Donald Trump and the Trump Corporation over the last decade. But you know, the tax returns, there's the questions about self-dealing. There's an awful lot here, and I don't want to minimize the importance of this, right? If Donald Trump is running for the presidency in part because he counts himself as a successful, but if his success seems to depend in part on corruption or misrepresentation, then that is publicly relevant. Similarly, if there's self-dealing, if there's corruption, if important decisions are being made by our government, not on the basis of what the best policy is, but how best to profit the president or his supporters, that is publicly relevant. But I do want to suggest that the most important issues in this campaign, frankly, transcend the personal corruption of the president, if that is in fact accurate. And part of the problem here is we don't have all the information, and the journalists who are covering this, of course, don't have subpoena powers, so they cannot get the records. And of the subpoenas that might eventually lead to criminal prosecution of the Trump organization or even of the president himself, are caught up in court battles, right? And so it'll be a while before those play out, certainly till after the election. But having said all of that, I do want to say that to my mind, the most important issues here have to do with who is going to manage the coronavirus effectively, right? We're not out of the woods on that. There was that striking instance where the coronavirus was referred to in the past tense during one of the speeches at the Republican nominating convention. It's not the past tense. It's very much with us and very much dangerous, deadly at the moment. Who can effectively lead us on that? That seems to me to be an essential issue. The economic damage and pain that the virus is causing, who can effectively rebuild the economy while getting the virus under control? What's happening with climate change, as we see with these storms and these fires? Again, essential issues. What we can do about systemic racial injustice in our society, about, in particular, police violence against African Americans, but much deeper issues than that as well. It seems to me that all of this is essential, and we need to not lose track of those issues by focusing on the corruption to the extent that it's accurate. Yes, it's a real issue. In another campaign, it might be the issue. In this election, it seems to me that in a sense it takes a backseat to other more urgent issues. Does anybody else have at this moment? Anybody from the atrium? All right. So then I think I will wrap things up.
I wanted to say something.
Oh, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Okay, I know there's something that wasn't mentioned at all. I have a concern about the payroll tax, and the Mr. Trump's wants to do away with the payroll tax. So the payroll tax will affect us as far as Social Security, Medicare is concerned, and all future generations. Are we about to just let that go by and just not think about it? And the other point that it was that he had suspended payroll tax, and anyone who didn't pay the payroll tax because of the suspension still has to pay him that money in the future next year. I don't understand why people are just ignoring this when it affects so many.
Yeah,
my name is June, by the way. I'm not this number. I don't know how to change the number on my screen.
That's okay. June, did you say?
Yes. Yes.
Nice to meet you, June. And so great point. And I'll point out two things here. First of all, that the president cannot unilaterally change payroll tax policy, right? And,
okay.
And I actually happen to favor increasing the payroll tax, not in the sense of the amount, but the threshold. Right now, if you earn over $120,000, you don't pay payroll tax above that amount. You should pay up to maybe 250 or 400. But anyway, be that as it may, it is possible that the president can, through executive action, create a hiatus in which the payroll tax has to be paid, right? And that's what he's proposing. Basically, don't pay it for the remainder of this year, but then make it up in the future. Now, who actually administers this? Employers administer it, right? And employers, my understanding is the vast majority of them are not in fact acting on the position that the president through executive action choose to spend the payroll. That's a first thing to note. The president is saying this, whether it's actually happening is a separate issue. And this is the limits of executive action, right? Executive action is not legislation. But the reason that employers are not stopping the payroll tax withholding is because they recognize this is for a few months, and then a few months later they're going to have to increase the withholding. That's not good for employees, and it's really difficult to administer. So I would put this in a slightly different category. This is a desperate ploy from the president to do everything he can to help the economy at the moment, because we're going into an election, and frankly, his fate depends on how well the economy is doing. But when the Republicans in the Senate are not willing to go along with much stimulus or extension of unemployment benefits, et cetera. We'll talk more about that next week. Benefit at the end of July, right? We're now very close to the end of August. Billions of dollars of financial support for families has been lost because of the inability to reach a compromise on this issue. And where I'll go next week is to suggest to you that serious damage is being done both to families and children, but also to the economy as a whole. And Trump is trying to counteract this, but frankly, the payroll tax, his substitute $300 unemployment benefit are not going very far in doing it. All right, is the final question for today? Then I'm going to say it was a pleasure as always. Please continue to be smart and take care of yourselves. We will get back together next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.